Hello and welcome to this video, which is going to go through some key information about what caused the American Civil War. So in 1861, the northern and southern states of the USA went to war with each other. The American Civil War lasted from 1861 to 1865, and about 750,000 people died during the American Civil War. The Civil War was fought between two sides, the northern and the southern states of the USA, as you can see on the map to your side. The northern states were known as the Union, and the southern states were known as the Confederacy. The tensions that led to the American Civil War had been around for years and years, but the trigger factor was the election of Abraham Lincoln, which caused a serious division, bringing about the start of the war. So let's just go through the big picture of what caused the American Civil War. So tension over slavery was the main cause of the American Civil War. And we might describe this as the underlying factor that made everything sort of crucial in terms of the cause of the American Civil War. Slave owners depended on slavery continuing as it supported a huge industry of trade and shipping. By 1850, the cotton produced was worth $1.3 billion. The Clay Compromise is something we're going to find out about, was a victory for slaveholders as it forced the North to return runaway slaves. In the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 broke the Missouri Compromise and allowed both states to join the Union as free states. There was violence in Bleeding, Kansas following this, as both sides tried to take control of the state and tried to bring slavery into those two states. And then another key cause of the American Civil War was that the South claimed the North was restricting what's called their states' rights and split away to defend those rights. That's another key factor as opposed to slavery. So Southern states argued it was their duty to protect the rights of individual states to control their own affairs. A small group of Southerners suggested the Southern states cut away or leave, and the word that we use there is secede from the Union and form their own country where slavery was encouraged and supported. Lincoln's victory in the 1860 presidential election was crucial. It brought the issue of states' rights to a head, and Southerners saw this as a sign that the North would end slavery and their whole way of life. In November 1860, the state government of South Carolina voted 169-0 to secede the Union, and a further 6 states, including places like Mississippi, Florida, and Texas, seceded to join the Confederacy of States. The Confederacy elected a new government led by Jefferson Davis. Lincoln declared that this was illegal, and he left Union troops and fought across the South. Fort Sumter was attacked, triggering the war. So the Civil War was due to political, economic and social divisions which were built up for many years. There were many long-term tensions between the North and the South. And one of the things to think about is the differences between the North and the South. So the North was a modern capitalist system where people could make profits. There was a mixed economy. There was farming, small businesses and factories. Money was made through the work of paid employees. In the North, they believed that slavery was unfair competition for business, and factory owners as slaves were not paid. In 1856, the Republican Party was formed, and that was very popular in the North, and subsequently Abraham Lincoln's Republican Party won a presidential election of 1860. In terms of the South, there was a semi-modern plantation system dominated by a few powerful slaveholders. It was mostly agricultural, dominated by large plantations. There was very little industry. They made money through the work of slave labour, cotton growing, which is huge business. They believed that slavery was natural, and modern factories and capitalist businesses made white workers into what they called wage slaves. The Democratic Party was popular in the South and was pro-slavery. So the American Civil War is complex, but it's important to understand the background and story to it. There were long-term tensions and short-term events that exacerbated the conflict, but the underlying cause of the tension was slavery. Other factors were the issue of states' rights and the fundamental differences between the North and South. The election of Abraham Lincoln, sometimes known as Honest Abe, as president in 1860, triggered the secession of states and led to the American Civil War in 1861. We're going to look at now in a little bit more detail about the cause of the American Civil War by looking at the story of how it developed. We're going to look at that in 4 different groups. We're going to look at early tensions and the expansion of slavery. So that's the development of the cotton gin, the Louisiana Purchase and Missouri Compromise. We're going to talk about abolitionists who campaigned against slavery, increasing tensions between the North and the South, people like William Lloyd Garrison, the Underground Railroad, for example. We're going to talk about how the struggle deepened in the 1850s after the Clay Compromise. We'll talk about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is absolutely key, which led to Bleeding, Kansas, the election of James Buchanan as president in 1856, and then John Brown, who was an abolitionist, attacking Harper's Ferry in 1859. We're then going to talk about the election of President Lincoln as the key trigger factor. We're then going to find out about how war developed and South Carolina seceded and another 6 states soon joined, and the Confederate government was elected by Jefferson Davis. That then led to Lincoln making a speech saying that it was illegal for the Confederacy to form their own country, and that led to Fort Sumter being attacked, and that led to the outbreak of the American Civil War. So let's look at some of these early tensions. So one of the key reasons for the American Civil War is that the tensions that caused the American Civil War were there right from the birth of the USA. So the cotton gin was a key sort of long-term factor because it sped up the production of cotton, leading to a greater demand for enslaved people. So it made slavery even more of an issue and made the southern economy and the southern states like Alabama, Mississippi, much more reliant on slavery. In addition to that, Louisiana Purchase in 1803 was also a long-term cause of the American Civil War because it increased the territory that the USA was colonizing, and it led to new states joining the US and a huge expansion of slavery in the South in what became known as the Cotton Kingdom. That led to lots of political tensions in terms of whether the North or the South would have control or would dominate the federal government in America, the Congress, etc. And this led to the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Now, the Missouri Compromise was a compromise agreement that slave and free states would be added in pairs to keep the balance of power. When Missouri was added as a slave state, Maine was added as a free state in the Northeast. The Missouri Compromise was never going to be a permanent solution, and it demonstrates the long-term tensions and political tensions over slavery. So there's some of the early tensions. So you could certainly write a paragraph about early tensions causing the American Civil War. So another key cause to be aware of is the abolitionists. So abolitionists began to campaign against slavery from the 1830s, and their campaigns had impact and created further tensions between the North and the South. You could say that they exacerbated the early tensions over slavery between North and South. So some examples of this: William Lloyd Garrison and Arthur Tappan formed the Anti-Slavery Society in 1833, which heightened tensions between the North and South over the issue. The Underground Railroad further exacerbated tensions as it led to enslaved people in the South being helped to escape to the free North. Key individuals involved in this were Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. The Underground Railroad was not an actual railroad at all, and it wasn't even underground, but it was called a railroad because of the different routes that were used to basically take enslaved people out of the South into the North, and it was called underground because it was all secretive. Now, another key event to know about is that Congress banned slavery in the new territories in 1846, and that increased political tensions and called into question the Missouri Compromise. At the time, Congress was dominated by Northern politicians. Now, an absolute key event is the Clay Compromise of 1850, named after Kentucky Senator Henry Clay, you can see pictured there. This all came to a head because California joined the US as a free state in 1850. Remember the California Gold Rush. But the compromise favoured the South as it allowed new territories to vote on slavery and allowed escaped enslaved people to be returned to the South with the so-called Fugitive Slave Act. So it definitely increased the power of Southern slaveholders, the Clay Compromise, and began to upset the balance that had been kind of established by the Missouri Compromise. Yeah, so it's just a little bit of a reminder here about some of the abolitionists who campaigned against slavery, as William Lloyd Garrison, who created the Anti-Slavery Society, Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, very much involved in the Underground Railroad. Then Harriet Beecher Stowe was really significant because she published a novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1851 that spoke out against slavery and showed what life was like for enslaved people, and it sold 2 million copies in 10 years. So the struggle deepened in the 1850s. So this is more of the short-term cause of the American Civil War, but still very much linked to slavery. So the key point here is that tension increased massively in the 1850s due to westward expansion, a new territory that had been taken in the US-Mexico War, which lasted from 1846 to 1848. So territories that would later become places like Nevada and New Mexico, for example. In the 1850s, there were already extensive fighting and a civil war, really, in the West, particularly in Kansas, but also fighting in Nebraska. Now, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 is absolutely crucial for the causing of the American Civil War. Now, this overturned the Missouri Compromise, which had held tension at bay for years. Kansas and Nebraska were both above the Missouri line. So the fact that these territories could even consider having slavery very much went against the Missouri Compromise. So it kind of destroyed the Missouri Compromise, which had held the tensions over slavery at bay since 1820. This led to a period of fighting within Kansas, which has been referred to by historians as, quote, bleeding Kansas. Abolitionists and pro-slavery campaigners moved into Kansas in order to try and influence the vote that was being taken on whether there should be slavery in Kansas. And this actually led to the formation, basically, of two separate governments within Kansas, one that supported slavery and one that didn't. So over 200 were killed in that violence. In 1856, tensions increased further when James Buchanan, who was a Democrat and supported the spread of slavery, was elected president. Furthermore, the Supreme Court Dred Scott decision of 1857 said Congress could not ban slavery in the states, and very much linked to states' rights. In 1859, kind of like almost foreshadowing the conflict of the Civil War, John Brown, an abolitionist, attacked a weapons store at Harper's Ferry in West Virginia, which led to abolitionists being seen as a greater threat and further heightened tensions. So by the end of the 1850s, there's lots of tension. There's tension over slavery. The Missouri Compromise has been overturned, and the abolitionists are becoming increasingly violent, and there's ever more likelihood of fighting breaking out. So now we get to Abraham Lincoln. The Republican Party was formed in 1856, partly in opposition to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and the Republican Party was against slavery. Now, Abraham Lincoln quickly became a leading figure, and he was their candidate for the presidential election in 1860, and he won a landslide victory, albeit getting all of his votes from the free states in the north and in the west. And you can see on the election map there, color-coded in red, are the places that Abraham Lincoln won. Now, Lincoln was very much presented in the election campaign as an ordinary American, honest Abe. He was presenting himself as the so-called rail splitter to show that he was a hard-working American. He'd been involved in splitting logs to help build the railroads. And Abraham Lincoln was committed to preserving the Union of the United States of America. And Abraham Lincoln felt that the best way to do that would be to end slavery, and that would end, therefore, all the arguments about slavery. Now, this is the trigger for the American Civil War. So it's worth writing about the election of Abraham Lincoln as an event which basically brings to the fore all of those different tensions, and basically means that when he is elected as president with that commitment to end slavery, that there's going to be some kind of dispute, some kind of conflict between the North and South. So this had quite a dramatic effect, Lincoln's election as president. It crystallized, that's a nice historical language to use, the divisions between the North and South. States in the North wanted more control over their own states and resented the federal government interference. This is where you can talk about states' rights. South Carolina was the first to secede, and other states soon followed. So only a few days after the presidential election, South Carolina voted 169-0 to secede, and in the winter of 1860-61, another 6 states seceded: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. And essentially what they were doing is they were forming their own country, which is going to be the Confederate States. Now, the Confederate States elected their own government in Montgomery, Alabama. Jefferson Davis became their president. In July 1861, the capital moved to Richmond, Virginia. Now, Jefferson Davis was a southern slaveholder and was very much pro-slavery. So we see now we've almost got 2 separate governments created in America between the North and the South. Now, at this stage, President Lincoln was not willing to let the Confederate States leave without a fight, so he made a speech saying that the Confederacy was illegal. He left federal forces within forts in the South, so that led to Confederates opening fire at Fort Sumter on Union soldiers in South Carolina, and that's what basically sparked the American Civil War to essentially kick off. So there you have it, the main reasons for what caused the American Civil Wars. A nice little summary there for you to focus on. So you've got things like long-term causes linked to slavery, some of the more short-term causes linked to slavery, thinking about how the Clay Compromise and California becoming a free state in 1850 is a really important factor for further increasing the tensions. Obviously, the election of Lincoln as a key trigger factor, and then a couple of alternative arguments to slavery, so you can talk about states' rights, or just those general differences between the North and South. So there you have it, that's what caused the American Civil War. Thanks very much for listening, bye-bye.